report on the chat if you.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, thank you for having me today and providing that opportunity to share some of the ideas and thinking from my book, Systemic Racism and Educational Measurement. In the book, I cover a lot of topics, a lot of issues related, obviously, to racism and educational measurement. And during today's talk, I'm going to touch on a few what I think are foundational concepts for everything I explore in the book, and then focus in on the idea of really Charles Mills's concept of rectificatory justice and how it might be applied to begin to transform educational measurement, particularly around selection admissions tests, so that they're shifting from operating as apparatus for systemic racism to operating as anti-racist agents. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the large body of literature developed over the past 150 years, most of it produced by scholars and activists of color, that informs my work, but which is largely unknown to many of us, particularly those in the field of educational measurement. When I began this project in almost, I guess it's 9 years ago now, in 2015, I was familiar with terms like race and racism, but at the time, I held a nascent understanding of them. And I really viewed racism primarily as individual thoughts and actions. And although race is a variable that I and many people have included in analyses of educational data, and racism is mentioned in some literature produced in the field of educational research, there's surprisingly little written about race and racism by those who work in the field of educational measurement. In contrast, the fields of history, sociology, criminal justice, philosophy, health, and so on, have developed an expansive body of literature. And as I read from this body, I found myself being pointed to more and more works. In fact, it's reached the point where I've had to take over my son's former bedroom, and it's now my library on race, racism, and the structuring of various forms of oppression. The core argument I present in the book is that our field of educational measurement has and continues to be operated as apparatus of and for systemic racism in the US. While there are many goals I hope my book works towards, my primary aims were to help deepen understanding of several ways in which educational measurement functions and its function as apparatus for systemic racism. And through that understanding, begin to transform practices and uses made of test instruments and quantitative analyses our field produces, and the uses that we make of them so that they function as anti-racist apparatus. To accomplish this, I organized the book in three sections. The first section provides a deep exploration of the concept of race as a social construct, systemic racism, and the racialized ideology that Joe Fagan, a sociologist, terms the white racial frame. Some people have asked why I invest so much space exploring these topics, and my reason is quite simple. I think our field of educational measurement has not grappled deeply with the issues of race and racism. And as evidence, I document over the past decade, only 6 articles published in our 2 leading journals published through NCME even mention racism. And while a handful of articles use the term race, not one defines what is meant by the term. So I think it's really important for us to really deepen our understanding of race, systemic racism, and the white racial frame in order to position ourselves to be to address some of the challenges these concepts present to the field. The second section then examines a few ways in which the white racial frame influenced early developments in educational measurement, many of which continue to have impact on our practice today. In this section, I also conduct an analysis of several ways in which educational measurement functions as apparatus for systemic racism today. I'll touch upon that, a little bit of that in the talk today. Because being critical involves both pointing out problems and offering potential paths forward, The final section examines several modern social theories and considers implications that each theory has for shifting our practices to better support an anti-racist endeavor. Again, the book covers a great deal of ground, and in the time remaining, I can only touch upon a few ideas that I hope are of interest to you. Before I dive in, I want to just provide some working definitions so that at least you understand how I'm using terms. The first term I want to focus on is what I think of as educational measurement. Through my training as a student, the training I provide as a professor, and the work I do in the field, I've come to understand educational measurement as being a relatively broad concept or field that comprises two core elements. The first is the design, development, and use of tests and other data collection instruments that are used to collect information about cognitive, affective, and psychological constructs that are valued by educators in our educational system. The second component is the use of scores provided by these various instruments to inform decisions about students, groups of students, and the efficacy of educational programs, interventions, policies, practices, and so on. Given this working definition of educational measurement, I now want to turn to the concept of race itself and how I understand that. As a personal reflection, I think it's important for me to acknowledge that for most of my lifetime, I operated with an understanding of race as a biological genetic trait that was within us. About 15, 20 years ago, I began to hear colleagues and other scholars talking about race as a social construct. And like many academics, I began to adopt that phrasing, but I didn't really have a firm understanding what it meant. In the first two chapters, I delved deeply into this meaning, learning from and integrating the work of many scholars who've engaged deeply with this topic over the past century. I now embrace a definition that recognizes race as the use of ocular and at times ethnic characteristics to structure people in a hierarchical manner with specious attribution of superiority and inferiority given to these groupings. I also recognize that race is constructed and used as a tool for justifying the inequitable distribution of power, opportunity, and resources along racialized lines within our society. As a social construct, I also recognize the ways in which racialized classifications have and continue to evolve in order to maintain advantage for the dominant racialized group, that is, people membered white in the US. In the book, you'll note that I intentionally use the phrase membered white, membered black, and so on to reinforce the retraining of my understanding of race as a social construct. In effect, I see racialized categories as being constructed by society in order to allow certain people to be membered white, or in turn to be membered into other racialized groups that are not granted the same advantages provided to people who are membered white. One aspect of race as a social construct that is fascinating to consider, at least for me, was the timing of the construction of the concept of race as a biological trait. A particular note is that race as a biological concept occurred long after racialized oppression in the form of enslavement was well established in Europe and the American continents. In fact, if you look at this timeline, you can see that race as biological was introduced more than 200 years after the Portuguese first captured and enslaved the people they termed Black Moors living along the western coast of Africa. And it wasn't until the 1800s that dictionaries in England and France formally changed their definitions of race to reflect this newly introduced concept of race as a scientific biological concept. In the book, I won't go through all this now, but in the book, I spend a considerable amount of time also exploring how the concept of race and the definitions of racialized groups have been molded and remolded over time in response to various social and economic challenges that were being encountered in the US. And so in one place where you see this very clearly is in the census, and how the census changes and introduces and then removes various racialized categorizations. You can also see this in court rulings. There's at least 52 federal and US Supreme Court rulings that focus specifically on racialized identity of plaintiffs. And in two of those cases, you can see one judge, the same judge, Justice Sutherland, within a year's time, changing his rationale for how you determine whether a person is white or not. In one case, relying on the then scientific, quote unquote, scientific definition of Caucasian to exclude a Japanese man as white, despite his very apparently white skin. And later on, ignoring that same definition of Caucasian, which included Aryans, to exclude an Aryan man from India from being white. So you can see this flexibility that people have used in the construction and reconstruction of racialized groups. Since the book was published, I've continued to think about race as a social construct, and through Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, various intersectionality theorists, and perhaps most impactfully, the novelist Zadie Smith, I began to rethink the idea of various categories of identity. Again, it's moving away from my old notion of race as something that it comes from within us. I've moved to thinking about identity categories such as gender, class, race, sexuality, and so on, not as identities, but rather as social structures. That is, as categories that are put onto us, and once adorned, these categories structure how we perceive ourselves, how others perceive us, and in too many cases, the ease with which we are able to access power, opportunity, and resources. And while I won't elaborate on this idea of structuring now, I encourage you to view the tutorial on intersectionality and quantitative analyses that NCME just released, in which I do touch up on this in greater detail. It's part of the new, the ongoing items series that NCME has. In the book, I also explore a variety of implications that race as a social construct has for educational measurement. Again, I don't have time to elaborate on these today, but some of the implications include shifting our use of race as an explanatory variable and instead directing attention on racism as causal, developing more direct measures of experiences with various forms of racism and other forms of oppression, recognizing the intersectional manner in which oppression operates, and applying an intersectional lens to our analyses, particularly when we're looking at test bias in our field, and altering the discourse we use when discussing racialized differences to avoid the reproduction of deficit discourse, and ideally, introduce anti-racist discourse to our field. Oops, sorry. A third term I want to touch on is racism itself. As I noted at the start of the talk, my understanding of race and racism has been informed by a large body of literature that's been developed over the last 150 years. In reading this work, I found myself confronted with an expanding body of terminology. This image is a word cloud produced from about 150 pages of notes taken at one point when I was working on the book. It's terms and concepts such as these that I have found useful to engage with when deepening my understanding of race and racism and trying to understand how these different terms are similar and when it's important to recognize them as being different. And in struggling through that, I ended up developing my own model of systemic racism to help clarify how these different ideas and concepts fit together. In this model, the concept, or at least systemic racism, as I think about it, begins and ends with power. Power is used as a to form a racialized ideology that justifies the current social system and the disparate outcomes it produces. In turn, racialized ideology informs a variety of narratives that are shared through public speeches, press, and so forth. And what those narratives do is condition us to think about people in different ways. And in turn, those narratives influence our individual practices, and these manifest in individual forms of racism. These narratives also influence people that run institutions, and in turn, the institutional policies and practices that impact the people that work within the institutions and who interact with those institutions. Separate from what occurs within specific institutions, historical and current laws and regulations operate to structure society in ways that produce structural racism. As just one example, consider how federal redline housing and loan policies structured the racial composition of suburban and urban communities in the 1950s and 60s, and how this structuring persists today. Collectively, individual, institutional, and structural racism operate separately and interactively to produce disparate outcomes in all sectors of our social system, which in turn produce harm for members of non-dominant racialized groups and advantage for members of dominant racialized groups. In turn, this advantage serves to maintain power, and while these harms and advantages are not distributed evenly within any racialized group, they are produced and reproduced systematically through this complex system termed systemic racism. Now, in sharing this, I'm not suggesting that everybody adopt this, but it provides an example of how when you really struggle to understand these various concepts associated with racism, how it leads to a really rich and complex model of how systemic racism is operating in the U.S. I've also been using this term apparatus, and I think I borrow that from Michel Foucault, and I think it's a useful term because, as Foucault thinks about apparatus, they're often tools, practices, policies, in some cases, ideologies that are introduced, often initially when they're introduced for good, but which over time are repurposed in different ways. And so we can think about, for example, income tax as apparatus in the US that was initially introduced to generate funds to support various public projects and institutions. Over time, the apparatus of income tax has been modified in various ways. So, for example, we see changes to tax credits that are promoting marriage and the rearing of children, which in effect then promoted this concept of one concept of the family and encouraged population growth among a segment of our society. Today, we see income tax again being used as apparatus to encourage the adoption and consumption of green technologies, such as electric cars and solar energy. So the idea of apparatus I think, is useful, and particularly when we think about educational measurement, educational tests, as apparatus that are operating to have influence on people in our society. I also borrow this idea of racist and anti-racist projects from Omi and Wanat. And in reality, the concept of racist and anti-racist projects is somewhat similar to the concept of apparatus, with the addition that they're focusing on racist projects are effectively apparatus that are employed, refined, or repurposed over time in ways that become racially oppressive or sustain a racialized oppressive system. Whereas anti-racist projects are apparatus applied to challenge existing racialized meanings and disrupt or rectify existing disparities between racialized groups. And so I'm going to talk in a few minutes about admissions testing and how it has functioned effectively as a racist apparatus, and how we might alter some of the practices so that it functions more in an anti-racist manner. I'm going to skip through some of this just in the interest of time. But one of the analyses that I do in the book, and that I think is very useful when we think about admissions testing, is to think about how different sectors of our society interact to end up producing racialized disparities in a variety of outcomes. And so in this slide, what I'm doing is I begin with the redline housing and loan practices that ended up creating segregated communities, and how this segregation has largely persisted over the decades, and in turns has influenced. So my clicking's not working here. Yeah, has influenced how things like schools, access to food, access to health, has differed across communities that were created through the redlining process, and how in turn all of those influence the production of educational outcomes. Again, producing or contributing to the production of different outcomes in these segregated communities. And in turn, how differences in educational opportunities impact test scores. So when we think about admissions, college admissions in particular, we have all these other factors that are contributing to the production of the test scores, of the differences in test scores. And of course, when test scores are then used to make decisions about admission into a college and university higher education, it then leads to disparities in terms of who has access. And those disparities, again, are a direct reflection of past policies and practices that created these segregated communities. And in turn, we all know that access to higher education then has a great influence on access to various jobs. And in turn, that access to jobs has influence on wealth disparities. And in turn, those wealth disparities then often reinforce the segregated communities that were first produced through redlining practices. And so this ends up becoming a cycle. It interacts as well with policing practices in the criminal justice system as well, but I won't touch on that in today's talk. So, one of the issues that I think we really, as a field, need to think about is how we can adopt alternate frames that may better position us to address some of the challenges that come about because of the way in which our field has been influenced by racism and how it at times functions as apparatus for sustaining racist outcomes. And although I don't have concrete answers to how we address all of these challenges, I believe the first step is that we need to deepen our understanding of these alternate frames. So as I mentioned in the third section, I explore how each of these modern social theories might be applied to alter some practices in educational measurement. Earlier, I mentioned intersectionality, and in the book, I explore how it can be used to modify our approach to examining test bias. And although I didn't specifically mention it, tenets of critical race theory are key to helping us modifying the meaning we give to race, the use of race in our analyses, and the discourse we use when discussing findings that focus on differences across racialized groups. I also touch on how tenets of quant crit, as well as some concepts within intersectionality theory, can inform development of new measures that more directly reflect exposure to and experiences with oppression and advantage, and how use of those really, I believe, will help deepen our understanding of what really is producing these differences in educational outcomes. But what I really want to turn to now is the concept of rectificatory justice and how that holds, I think, great potential for reforming the role our tests function as apparatus for systemic racism. So to understand rectificatory justice, it's useful to step back and think about theories of justice more broadly. In the US, our current form of justice reflects a utilitarian form of justice. And in a utilitarian form of justice, the primary aim is to maximize net benefit for a society. And here, benefit is conceptualized as any of a variety of outcomes, whether they be economic, personal freedoms, opportunities for leisure, access to education, and so on. And what is key in the utilitarian form is the focus on net benefit, or benefit as averaged across all people. John Stuart Mill termed this the greatest happiness principle, which Michael Sandel summarizes as, quote, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, unquote. What's important to note in this principle is that the greatest benefit or happiness can occur within a society despite harm being produced for some people. And so, in effect, this utilitarian concept of justice was used to justify enslavement. was an economic system that produced great economic benefit for many in our nation through harm to those who were enslaved. John Rawls raises concern about this tolerance for harm, and as part of his theory of justice as fairness, Rawls argues that just decisions and programs should maximize benefit for all. By focusing on benefit for all, Rawls pushes back on the notion of justice being based on net benefit, and instead argues that justice must not tolerate harm to anyone. In doing so, however, Rawls acknowledges that the level of benefit may vary across people. So in essence, you may have an equitable distribution of benefit, but everybody is benefiting in some way. So again, no one person or group of persons should experience harm. In this theory, Rawls also argues that when there are two options that will similarly maximize benefit for all, the option that provides the greatest benefit for those least advantaged in society should be selected. Now, Charles Mills, who unfortunately passed away recently, as he was developing this theory of rectificatory justice, is critical of Rawls because Rawls' theory assumes that all people enter a societal arrangement with equal footing. In effect, Charles Mills argues that adopting Rawls' approach to justice in a society where past wrongs have created persistent harm for a subgroup of people is problematic. In his theory of rectificatory justice, Mills argues that a just program must give priority to options that rectify past injustices, the effects of which persist to this day. So you may be wondering how these theories of justice pertain to educational measurement. Again, in the book, I argue that educational measurement has operated primarily under a utilitarian form of justice. We see this in the practices employed when conducting bias analyses. When statistical bias is detected, rather than straight out removing the item, we subject it to review, and only if reviewers can identify a cause for bias is the item removed. In effect, this practice benefits the test developers by saving development costs and benefits those test takers who are positively affected by bias, while producing harm for those subgroups, often small subgroups, that are flagged for bias. Similarly, our focus on mean effects of interventions typically fail to consider the degree to which an effect is distributed within subgroups of students. And as a result, we run the risk of adopting practices that are more beneficial for those students who are most advantaged, the effects of which may further widen disparities. And through Jennifer Randall's analyses of test content, we see a utilitarian approach in the pursuit of context-neutral test items, an endeavor that tends to privilege the cultural knowledge and experience of members of the most advantaged groups to the detriment of the most disadvantaged groups. Again, in the book, I explore several changes to test development and test use that would result if our work was driven by a rectificatory theory of justice rather than utilitarian aims. In the time remaining, I want to focus on how rectificatory justice can be applied to selection decisions for both secondary and higher education, particularly for public schools. To frame this discussion, I want to make clear that I understand public education as a public good that provides benefit to members of that public. Given the ways in which one's prior educational experiences influences one's opportunity for future educational experiences, and how higher levels of educational experiences similarly influence one's access to various forms of employment, which in turn influences one's access to wealth and other benefits that flow from wealth, public education plays an essential role in the distribution of various benefits in our society. In its current form, the use of test scores as part of admissions decisions apply the logic of individual merit and treat test scores as though they are the product of the individual. As I depicted a few minutes ago, this embrace of individual merit tends to ignore the many ways in which our social system contributes to the production of each person's test score, and more importantly, how disparities throughout that system produce inequities in educational opportunity, which are reflected in those test scores. The use of these scores, which are a product of both the individual and the system in which the individual lives, limits exposure to further educational opportunity for those individuals who are most disadvantaged by the system, while granting further opportunity to those who are most advantaged by the system. As we are all well aware, over the past few years, several colleges and universities have adopted test optional or no test policies. Although this approach decreases the influence prior educational opportunities has on access to future opportunities, it does not fully rectify the impact past inequities has on future educational attainment, for the simple reason that students who experience less robust educational experiences are not as well positioned for success in future educational settings compared to those who experience more robust educational experiences. Through a rectificatory approach, test scores remain valuable, but their use shifts from informing the admission decision itself to shaping access to supports and services that work to rectify past inequities. As a concrete example, consider the shift in the use of SAT and ACT scores by University of Texas, Austin. Instead of using test scores to inform admission decisions for students who attended public school in Texas, UT Austin requires test scores, but bases their decision largely on high school GPA. As Paul Tough accounts in his book, The Years That Matter Most, UT Austin then uses test scores to identify students with unusually low scores given their high GPA. For this subset of students, UT Austin provides instructional services that are designed to improve these students' opportunity for success in college studies. This approach results in both a more diverse student body and substantially higher graduation rates for students who were underserved by the system during their primary and secondary educational experiences. As Paul Tough documents, this approach to rectifying past inequities has been quite effective in positioning students for success in higher education, such that students identified and supported through this rectificatory use of test scores now graduate at higher rates than a general population of students. In addition to altering the use of test scores during the admission process, another rectificatory solution focuses on access to the test itself. Whether one focuses on test-based college admissions or admissions to a secondary exam school, in Boston Latin, for example, a student must have a test score to be considered for admission. Unfortunately, several factors influence the ease with which a student is able to take a required test. In some cases, the cost of the test creates a financial burden for some families. The location in which the test is administered can make it more challenging to access the test for some students. The time when the test is administered, often on a Saturday, can also create conflicts for some students. And knowledge about the test and administration options and beliefs about the possibility of attending an exam school or college also vary, and in turn may lead some students who are otherwise well positioned for admission not to take the test. And just as access to robust educational opportunities vary across racialized, ethnic, and economic groups of students, these factors similarly correlate to racialized and ethnic identity and economic status. When a test is required as part of the admission process, particularly for an exam school, a rectificatory approach that addresses many, if not all, of these factors is to provide all students easy access to the test administration. Rather than holding the test in a specialized location on a day outside of the school's schedule, a school district could administer the test to all students, or perhaps to all students who meet all other admission criteria, and then in their school during the normal school day. Further, rather than requiring students to formally apply to an exam school, a district could make their initial selections based on the full pool of students, notify those who are top candidates, and provide materials to families about the benefits of attending an exam school. Families would then have the option of accepting the opportunity or declining. Through a process such as this, all students have easy access to the test administration, and the impact that differences in knowledge about the application process have on a student's access to the application process are reduced, if not eliminated. Beyond these two approaches, there are many more ways in which we might alter our test development, administration, and use practices to help rectify inequities that are produced by our educational system. Our uses of tests within that system and our social system more generally. In fact, since the book went to press, I've come to realize the pursuit of justice, rather than technical quality or validity or fairness, should be the cornerstone of our work. By elevating justice in this way, the field of educational measurement would need to be explicit about its concept of justice and how the decisions we make work towards that conception. And given the system of races that operates our social system, it seems to me that centering rectificatory justice is essential for shifting the field from functioning as apparatus for systemic racism to that which supports an anti-racist endeavor. I think in the interest of time, I'll stop there, and we can just take questions, comments, reactions, thoughts that folks have.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Excellent presentation. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll give you access to the floor here.
Joseph, there's questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can throw a question in chat as well. So I have one question here. To what extent do those who produce tests have a justice lens in mind when they produce the test?
I'm trying to find the question. To what extent do those who produce tests have a justice lens in mind? Well, that's an interesting question. And I think it boils down to the definition of justice that people adopt. I would argue that, many people who are producing tests do think that tests can be used in the pursuit of justice, but it tends to be a utilitarian form of justice, right? And so when you look at the history of college admissions testing and the introduction of college admissions testing, there was a pursuit of justice in mind. And what they were trying to do was increase the body of students who had access, in particular, to the Ivy League schools. And they're trying to move away from primarily drawing students from the East Coast prep schools and try to get a more diverse body of students from across the nation. And so in that sense, that was a pursuit of justice, right? But in doing that, there wasn't a focus on issues of racism and other forms of oppression and how those might interact and impact access to and pursuit of higher education. And so that practice did, in fact, diversify the body of students that were getting into Ivy League schools and attending Ivy League schools. But it also made it more difficult for other groups of students to access those same schools. And so, that was a utilitarian form of justice that was being, I think, pursued. And I think that probably applies to almost all educational tests. Education is provided in the pursuit of justice. It's just what form of justice are we pursuing?
Excellent, thank you. We have another question in the chat. How could your thinking inform international measurement programs like PISA?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I occasionally think about that, and then I walk away from the question. So I've not fully formed an idea. But I guess my initial thoughts on international testing programs is that I think we have to be really careful what those programs are promoting, and whether they are promoting a very Euro-US centric conception of education and the goals of educational outcomes, and whether that may be creating harm in some countries that may have different perspectives, and whether it may be pushing those countries in directions that, yes, from a utilitarian perspective, it may position some students to be more better able to engage in this kind of world economic system that we've created. But I'm not sure it really benefits many students or all students in those countries. So I don't know. Like I said, I've started to think about it, but I really have not fully thought through my thinking on international tests and how that fits into this idea of a systemic racism. But I think it's an important question for folks to think about.
Great. We have another question or a pondering here, perhaps. How has your conception or definition of educational measurement been impacted by the inclusion of a critical perspective to the definition itself?
I'm not sure I fully understand that question. Is the question asking how my definition of educational measurement has shifted through a critical lens? I mean, if that's I guess I'll be a politician and create my own question and answer it. If that's the question, I'm not sure it really has changed my conception of what educational measurement is. I think it has changed my thinking about what it does. I still think about educational measurement as the creation of instruments that are used to collect data, as I said, about cognitive, psychological, and so forth, constructs that are valued by the system. I suppose one aspect of developing those that I think has changed in my thinking is who is defining what are those valuable constructs, what constructs are valued, and whose voices are being left out, and how can we include more people in defining what is important to measure and how we measure it. But that doesn't fundamentally change my conception of what educational measurement is. It's just how it might be functioned. Yeah, there's another question about interpreting tests through a lens of racism, not race. Yeah, so I've done some work on really looking carefully at the discourse that's used, particularly in quantitative analyses, often when test scores are being used as an outcome measure. And oftentimes, we'll talk about, like if we run a regression, people will talk about the effect of race, or they'll talk about students of a given racialized group lagging behind other groups. And that language, is putting a focus on race and the people who are membered into a racialized group as being the problematic, as opposed to putting focus on the experiences that those people have that are creating these differences in performance. And the failure of our educational system to create similar impacts for people regardless of their racialized categorizations, right? So the idea of changing that discourse so that we're not focused on race or the people who have been racialized, and instead focus on the experiences they have or the failures of the system to produce equitable outcomes. I think that's the kind of shift that I think about and encourage and try to make myself. And so the focus is put on the failure of the system or the shortcomings of the system rather than the shortcomings of the people that have been racialized.
Great, thank you. Lucy, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I have a question. Right. Good day. Thanks for this presentation. I have a question. It might seem more personal. We are using the book Systematic Racism in a course I'm doing. We really had time to it's a good read, very interesting, and have a lot of topical issues to discuss on. We've had some classes where we argued among ourselves, especially on this topic on race, especially talking about the origin of race and all that. But there's a key question that we had in class, and I think I will use this opportunity to ask it. If I can ask, how does this book, after being written, how is it being received in the white community? We know he's talking about racism generally, that a particular people have been disadvantaged over years. And we were like, how is the white community receiving this book and the message? How do they see it? And you as a person, how do you see yourself taking this study, like this research to produce this book?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say exactly how it's been received. I will say I've been surprised by the lack of criticism and critical feedback, or to put it another way, I've been surprised by the silence. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it means that people who might be less receptive to these ideas and arguments are simply not picking the book up and reading it, or you know, whether there may be you know, a fear of speaking up, you know, given the way our society is currently silencing people who have views that are counter to, you know, counter to others. So I'm not really sure what accounts for the silence, but I have been surprised by that. I mean, my goal in writing the book was to try to increase conversation and dialogue. And you know, again, that has happened to some extent, but I continue to be surprised by how little conversation and dialogue seems to be flowing from the book at this point. What was the second part of your question?
Okay, I was like, I'm talking about you as a person. You just answered summary that the key question was, what made you to go into the research force? Just like I said, we've had issues talking about it to the extent I had one ambassador that came to my school. I had to confront him on this issue about race. I and a colleague were looking at why the race categorization, when you see a demographic data, we started going deep into it. Based on reading this book, we started thinking in that direction. So you as a person, I don't know what propelled you to do the research, but to be of little interest, maybe you said.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think I tell the story in the preface that I was developing a seminar for our PhD program that was going to focus on some select seminal works in our field. So it was really, I was trying to develop a seminar that would look at, you know, the history of our field and key developments. And as I started reading a lot of the early works, I was aware that racism and sexism was at play in some of those works, but I didn't realize the extent to which it was there. And it was clearly influencing it, not so much the development of the instruments themselves, but the interpretations of scores that were coming from them. And so as a simple example, you know, with the Army Alpha that was used back in World War I, there was analyses that were being done looking at differences among different groups, some racialized and some immigrant groups. And it was just taken at face value that these differences were real. And there was no questioning whether the test instrument itself, the bias in the instrument, might be contributing to these differences. And you know, that's clearly an influence of the assumptions that people had about different groups of people at the time that was then influencing their practice, or in this case, lack of critical practice. So anyways, I was reading this as I was preparing for the seminar, and at the same time, you know, we were having all of the social outcry and elevated awareness for the various police killings that were occurring across the country. And it stimulated me to want to look more deeply at this issue. And frankly, like when I was an undergrad, I was a history major. I went to Brown. You didn't have any course requirements. I took 18 history courses. I had applied and was about to begin a history program. So it's kind of like in me to want to look at the history of issues once I get interested in something. So that was really the genesis.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Malositso, did you have a question?
I did. Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. Lovely book, lovely presentation. I think my question is around, and it's related to the previous question, but it also centers around the recent-ish competencies. And I would like to hear your thoughts on how part of this knowledge, or where you think this knowledge should fit into the canon, like as part of training programs, like graduate programs. So do we envision this to be like the first course that people take? Should it be included in courses of study? 1, 2, what can we all do in our little corners to make sure that more people know about this, right? So again, I'm not surprised that there wasn't a lot of reaction to this book from where we would expect for there to be reaction, because it's hard work. And I think in the foreword, you also mentioned how hard it was for you to reckon with all these facts. And so understandably, it's a hard work. However, what can we do, everyone in this room, even if it's a little action, to spread this message so that this becomes more mainstream? And as we all transition into positions of power, maybe faculty or whatever, like how can we move this along so that this becomes more mainstream?
Yeah, I chuckled as you started to ask that question, and I was looking at Jennifer. We just came from a meeting right before this where we're on that exact topic. I don't know. I mean, from my perspective, like in our program at Boston College, we've introduced a course called Critical Perspectives on Research Methodology, where and it's a required course that's offered the very first semester for both our master's and PhD students. And what we're trying to do there is early on in their training, help them understand some of the frame, particularly the positivist empirical frame that shaped the field, and then introduce some other more modern critical frames, and encourage us to then think about, just like I do in the last section of the book, think about how those frames might be used to alter some of our practices. And so we do that very early on, so that as they're going through other coursework, that those ideas that are already planted in their mind. And so they can be, when they're learning a statistical method, they can be critical of that, critical in a positive way, of the challenges of using that statistical method to address certain topics, interests of theirs. So I think that's one way of starting this. But I think there's a lot of different approaches that programs can take. Like, for example, at James Madison, where Sarah and Brian are, they've done a much fuller curriculum modification to be sure this is integrated throughout their whole program. And so it's a much deeper, and I think in the long run, more impactful integration and modification integration that they've done. I also see that there's a comment here from Carla. I think, one of the issues that I try to do in that first course is for people to reflect, very much like I had to do as I was working on this, on your own understandings, where those understandings came from, and how those understandings might be problematic in your work as you're pursuing, justice-oriented outcomes. And again, I think that's, in the last meeting, I was using the term that it's painful, right? In order, particularly for a white person like myself, who really did not have exposure in a meaningful way to issues of race and racism, it's painful to reflect on that, and then to recognize how how your understandings were problematic and how it then may have led to problematic practices that you didn't even know you're enacting. You know, so I think that's a really important part early on in people's training for them to start developing the comfort in being uncomfortable.
Excellent. Thank you. We're running out of time here. I want to be mindful of time. I just want to thank you so much, Michael, for this excellent talk. I think this has been a great conversation starter, and that's what this whole series is about, is getting the conversation going. And so I really encourage people to look more deeply into Dr. Russell's work and continue this conversation offline. With that noted, our next speaker series is going to be on November 1st, and we're going to have Dr. David Soul presenting on culturally specific assessments. So we hope you all join us then. Until then, we wish you all a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.